Karen, possibly drunk, with friends threw a party on my boat without asking. Turns out, unauthorized boarding comes with complimentary sailing lessons. If you've ever wanted to see entitled people discover what international waters really means, hit that like button. And drop a comment if you've ever had someone treat your property like their personal playground. My name's Marcus, I'm 34, and I've been restoring boats since I was 16. What started as a summer job at the marina became a full-time obsession, and 3 years ago, I finally bought my dream vessel. A 42-foot cabin cruiser named Sweet Revenge. The irony of that name would become apparent later. The boat was my weekend sanctuary, moored at Sunset Marina about 20 minutes from my apartment. Every Saturday morning, I drive down with my coffee and toolbox, spending the day fine-tuning engines, polishing brass, and generally pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. It was therapy with a marine diesel soundtrack. This particular Friday in July started like any other. I'd finished work early and decided to prep Sweet Revenge for a solo fishing trip I'd planned for Sunday morning. The marina was quiet, just the gentle sound of halyards chiming in the breeze and the occasional seagull offering commentary on my boat handling skills. I was in the engine compartment, checking oil levels, when I heard voices approaching from the dock. Multiple voices, getting louder and more slurred as they got closer. The kind of voices that suggested happy hour had started several hours ago and was showing no signs of slowing down. "This one's perfect," a woman's voice declared with the authority of someone who clearly knew nothing about boats. "Look at the size of it." I poked my head up from the engine bay to see a group of 5 people standing on the dock next to my boat. The apparent ringleader was a blonde woman in her 40s, wearing a white sundress that probably cost more than my monthly slip fee and holding a bottle of what appeared to be champagne. She had that particular brand of confidence that only comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. "Excuse me," I called out, climbing onto the deck. "Can I help you with something?" The woman, let's call her Karen because if it walks like an entitled duck and quacks like an entitled duck, looked at me like I'd just interrupted a royal proclamation. "Oh, are you the marina staff?" she asked, giving me the kind of smile people use when they're about to ask for something unreasonable. "We're looking to rent a boat for a little celebration." I glanced at her companions, 2 other women who looked like they'd raided the same expensive boutique, and 2 men who appeared to be along for the ride and the free drinks. All of them had the glazed look of people who'd started their celebration well before arriving at the marina. "I'm not marina staff," I replied, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "I'm the owner of this boat." Karen's smile got bigger, which somehow made it less friendly. "Even better, we'd like to charter your boat for the evening. How much would that cost?" There were so many things wrong with this request that I didn't know where to start. First, I wasn't a charter captain. Second, these people were clearly intoxicated. Third, and most importantly, chartering a boat required things like insurance, licenses, and basic sobriety, none of which appeared to be present. "Sorry, but I don't do charters," I said. "This is my personal boat." Karen's expression shifted from entitled friendliness to entitled irritation. "Come on, don't be difficult. We just want to use it for a few hours. We'll pay you well. It's not about money. I don't charter my boat to strangers, especially." I paused, trying to find a diplomatic way to say especially drunk strangers who clearly don't know port from starboard. "Especially what?" Karen challenged, her voice getting that edge that suggested we were transitioning from request to demand. "Especially people who haven't demonstrated they know how to operate a vessel safely," I finished. One of Karen's male companions, a guy wearing a polo shirt that looked like it had been ironed by someone else's money, stepped forward. "Look, buddy, we're not asking for a loan. We're offering to pay you to use your boat for one evening. It's just business." "And I'm declining the business," I replied. "Have a good evening, folks." I turned back toward the cabin, figuring that would end the conversation. But Karen and her crew didn't move. They stood there on the dock, having what appeared to be a heated discussion in voices they probably thought were whispers, but which carried across the water like foghorns. "He's being totally unreasonable," Karen hissed. "Maybe we should try somewhere else," suggested one of her female friends. "No. Karen replied with the determination of someone who'd clearly never met a problem she couldn't throw money at. This boat is perfect. Look at it. It's got everything we need. I continued working, hoping they'd eventually get bored and wander off to bother someone else. But after 20 minutes of increasingly loud whispering, I realized Karen had the persistence of a door-to-door salesman crossed with the entitlement of someone who'd never heard the word no. That's when I made my first mistake. I went below deck to grab more tools, leaving my boat unattended with a group of entitled drunks who'd apparently decided that no was just a starting point for negotiations. When I came back up 10 minutes later, Karen and friends had made themselves at home on my deck. That was like hostile takeover by champagne pirates. I emerged from below deck to find Karen lounging in my captain's chair like she'd just been crowned queen of the seven seas. Her friends had spread out across my deck. One couple was examining my fishing gear with the fascination of archaeologists discovering ancient artifacts, and someone had already opened the champagne. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, but Karen just waved me off like I was an annoying waiter. "Relax, we're just getting a feel for the boat," she said, swiveling in my chair like she was testing it for purchase. "This is nice. Really nice. How much did something like this cost?" The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They'd just conducted a friendly invasion of my boat, and now Karen was asking for my financial information like we were old friends comparing yacht club memberships. "Get off my boat," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. "Right now." "Come on, don't be like that," said Polo Shirt Guy, who'd apparently appointed himself as Karen's diplomatic corps. "We're not hurting anything. We're just looking around. And drinking my deck cushions apparently," I added, watching one of Karen's friends spill champagne on my recently cleaned up upholstery. "Oh, that's nothing," Karen said dismissively. "A little champagne never hurt anyone." The woman who'd spilled the champagne, a brunette wearing enough jewelry to open her own store, giggled and added, "Besides, we'll clean it up." Probably. That probably hung in the air like a threat. I walked over to Karen and stood next to the captain's chair. "I need you and your friends to leave. Now." Karen looked up at me with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. "But we haven't even started the party yet. There's not going to be a party. Not on my boat." "Look." Karen stood up and placed her hand on my arm with the familiarity of someone who'd never learned about personal boundaries. "I get it. You're protective of your investment. But we're responsible adults, and we're willing to pay you $1,000 for the evening." $1,000? For a few hours on my boat with a group of drunk strangers who'd already demonstrated their respect for other people's property by boarding without permission. It was actually insulting that she thought my integrity had such a low price tag. "Not for $10,000. I replied, removing her hand from my arm. "Please leave." That's when Karen's mask slipped completely. The fake friendliness evaporated, replaced by the kind of cold entitlement that probably made service workers across the city break out in stress hives. "Fine," she snapped. "But we're not going anywhere until we finish our drinks." And that's when I realized we'd moved from trespassing to hostage negotiation. Karen's crew had apparently interpreted her declaration as permission to make themselves even more comfortable. Polo Shirt Guy had found my cooler and was helping himself to my beer. The jewelry store brunette was taking selfies with my navigation equipment. The other couple was exploring my cabin like they were considering putting in an offer. "You can't just decide to stay on someone else's boat," I pointed out, but Karen was already back in my captain's chair, apparently planning the evening's entertainment. "We're not hurting anything," she repeated, like a mantra that would make trespassing legal if she said it enough times. "We'll be gone in a few hours." A few hours? I was starting to feel like I'd wandered into some kind of maritime fever dream. "Lady, I don't know you. You're drunk, you're on my boat without permission, and you're helping yourself to my supplies. This isn't a negotiation." Karen's response was to open another bottle of champagne. The cork flew past my head and landed in the water with a splash that seemed to punctuate the surreal nature of the situation. "Oops," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Butterfingers." That's when Polo Shirt Guy decided to escalate things. "You know what, man? You're being really uptight about this. We're just trying to have a good time." Maybe you should join us instead of being such a buzzkill. A buzzkill? For not wanting strangers to throw a party on my boat. I'm calling the marine police, I announced, pulling out my phone. Wait, Karen said, suddenly switching back to negotiation mode. There's no need for that. Look, what if we compromise? What if we just have a quick drink, and then we'll go? 30 minutes, tops. I looked at my phone, then at Karen, then at her friends who were making themselves increasingly at home on my deck. Calling the marine police would take time, and in the meantime, these people were going to keep treating my boat like their personal entertainment venue. That's when I had an idea. A beautifully terrible idea that would solve multiple problems at once. You know what? I said, putting my phone away and smiling for the first time since this nightmare began. You're right. Life's too short to be uptight about everything. Karen beamed like she'd just won a negotiation with a particularly difficult customer service representative. Now you're talking. See, I knew you were a reasonable guy. Absolutely. I agreed, walking over to the dock lines. In fact, why don't we take this party somewhere with a better view? I started untying the mooring lines, and Karen clapped her hands together like I'd just announced we were going to Disney World. Perfect. Where are we going? Oh, you'll love it, I replied, loosening the bow line. It's very private, very exclusive. No crowds, no interruptions. What I didn't mention was that it was also about 12 miles offshore, in international waters, where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest land was a very long swim away. Karen settled back into my captain's chair, champagne in hand, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just volunteered for a crash course in maritime consequences. As I fired up the engines, Karen and her crew erupted in cheers like they'd just been invited to the party of the century. Which, in a way, they had, just not the kind they were expecting. This is amazing, Karen shouted over the engine noise, raising her champagne bottle in what I can only assume was a toast to her own brilliance. I knew you'd come around. I smiled and waved from the helm, then slowly backed sweet revenge out of her slip. The marina was still quiet, just a few people on neighboring boats who watched us leave with the casual interest of people who had no idea they were witnessing the opening act of a maritime comedy show. Karen's friends had positioned themselves around the deck like they were posing for a luxury yacht magazine. Polo shirt guy had appointed himself as the boat's unofficial photographer, taking pictures of everyone against the sunset. The jewelry store brunette was live streaming the whole thing on her phone, narrating their spontaneous yacht party to her social media followers. We're on this gorgeous boat, she announced to her phone's camera, and we're heading out to sea for an exclusive party. This is so random and amazing. Random was definitely one way to describe it. As we cleared the marina's no-wake zone, I pushed the throttles forward and felt sweet revenge settle into her cruise. The boat handled beautifully, cutting through the calm evening water like she was built for exactly this kind of adventure. Which, in a way, she was, just usually with more willing passengers. Karen made her way up to the fly bridge where I was piloting. How far out are we going? She asked, steadying herself against the rail with one hand while clutching her champagne with the other. Oh, not too far, I replied. Just far enough to get away from all the marina traffic. You want privacy, right? Absolutely. This is perfect. My ex-husband would die if he knew I was on a boat this nice. He always said I was afraid of the water. Well, tonight's a great night to face your fears, I said, checking my GPS. We were about 3 miles out now, with about 9 miles to go. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been romantic under different circumstances. Karen's crew was getting more animated as the alcohol kicked in and the initial excitement of being on the water wore off into that comfortable buzz that makes terrible decisions seem like inspired choices. That's when the first sign of trouble appeared, clouds on the horizon. Now, I checked the weather before leaving, and there was supposed to be a small system moving through around midnight. Nothing dangerous, just some wind and light rain. But looking at those clouds, I was starting to think the weather service might have been a little optimistic about the timing. Is that a storm coming? Asked one of Karen's friends, pointing toward the darkening horizon. Just a little weather, I replied. Nothing to worry about. Which was technically true. For an experienced boater with a properly equipped vessel and a sober crew, a little evening weather was indeed nothing to worry about. But Karen and friends were about to discover that being drunk on a boat in choppy water was a very different experience than being drunk at a poolside bar. By the time we were 8 miles offshore, the wind had picked up and Sweet Revenge was starting to rock gently in the building swells. Most experienced boaters would describe the conditions as mild to moderate. Karen's crew, however, was experiencing what I like to call reality adjustment therapy. "Why is everything moving so much?" complained a brunette, who'd stopped live streaming and was now gripping the rail like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away. "It's called being on a boat," I explained helpfully. "The water moves, so the boat moves. Basic physics." Polo shirt guy, who'd been acting like the designated party coordinator, was looking decidedly less confident. "Maybe we should head back soon," he suggested. "You know, while we can still see the shore." I glanced back toward land, which was now just a faint line of lights on the horizon. "Oh, don't worry about that. We're not that far out," which was true in boat terms. 12 miles was nothing for Sweet Revenge. But for someone who'd never been more than ankle-deep in ocean water, 12 miles might as well have been 1,200. Karen, meanwhile, was still in full party mode, apparently determined to prove that a little thing like being in the middle of the ocean wasn't going to dampen her spirits. "This is so exciting," she declared, though her voice had taken on the slightly manic edge of someone who was beginning to suspect she might be in over her head. "Where exactly are we going?" asked the other woman in Karen's group, a quiet redhead who'd been mostly silent until now but was starting to look concerned. "We're almost there," I replied, checking my GPS again. "Just a few more minutes." What I didn't mention was that there was a spot I knew well, 12 miles offshore, far enough from land that cell phone service became unreliable, but not so far that we couldn't make it back when the time came. It was a place where the water was deep, the horizon was endless, and people had plenty of time to contemplate their life choices. As if on cue, Karen pulled out her phone to take more photos and frowned at the screen. "Is anyone else having trouble with their phone signal?" "Must be the weather," I said innocently. "Sometimes storms interfere with cell towers." The first drops of rain started to fall just as I cut the engines. "Why are we stopping?" Karen asked, and for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded less like an entitled customer and more like someone who was beginning to realize she might not be in control of the situation. "We're here," I announced cheerfully. "Welcome to your private party location." Karen and her friends looked around at the endless expanse of dark water surrounding us, then back at me, then at each other. The gentle rocking of the boat suddenly felt less like a fun adventure and more like a reminder that they were very small people on a very big ocean. "Here," Karen repeated. "But there's nothing here." "Exactly," I replied. "Total privacy. No crowds, no interruptions, no distractions. Just you, your friends, and the sea." The rain was starting to fall more steadily now, and the wind was picking up enough to make the boat's movement more pronounced. Karen's friends were beginning to look like they were regretting their spontaneous yacht party decision. That's when Karen finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "How do we get back?" I smiled and gestured toward the helm. "Well, that's where things get interesting." And in this moment, the reality of international waters sets in. "What do you mean, interesting?" Karen's voice had lost all its earlier confidence and taken on the tone of someone who'd just realized they might have made a tactical error. I walked over to the helm and made a show of checking various instruments, taking my time to build the dramatic tension. The rain was falling steadily now, and the boat's movement was becoming more noticeable as the swells increased. "Well," I said finally, "the thing is, operating a boat requires a certain level of experience and sobriety. And since I'm the only one here with a captain's license, and since you folks decided to board my boat without permission, I let the implication hang in the air like the gathering storm clouds." Karen's friends were starting to look genuinely concerned now. The jewelry store brunette had gone completely pale and was gripping the rail with both hands. Polo shirt guy was no longer taking pictures and had developed a distinctly greenish tinge around the gills. "You can't just leave us out here," Karen protested, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. It's amazing how quickly entitlement evaporates when you realize you're completely dependent on the person you've been treating badly. Leave you? I looked genuinely puzzled. Karen, I'm not leaving anyone. I'm right here with you. We're all in this together now. The quiet redhead spoke up for the second time. But you know how to drive the boat back, right? Of course I do, I replied. The question is whether I'm going to. That landed like a depth charge in the middle of their champagne-fueled party atmosphere. Karen's group exchanged glances that suggested they were finally beginning to grasp the full scope of their situation. Look, Karen said, switching to what I assumed was her negotiation voice. I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just head back to shore, and we can sort this whole thing out? Sort what out? I asked innocently. You wanted to use my boat for a party. You're getting to use my boat for a party. You wanted privacy. Well, congratulations, you can't get much more private than international waters. International waters? The quiet redhead had found her voice again, and it was climbing toward panic. How far out are we? About 12 miles, I replied. Far enough that we're outside U.S. territorial limits. Far enough that cell phone service is spotty at best. Far enough that if someone were to, say, accidentally fall overboard, it would be quite a swim back to shore. The brunette let out a small whimper and tightened her grip on the rail. Karen was clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling rapidly beyond her influence. This is kidnapping, she declared, apparently thinking that throwing around legal terms would somehow improve her position. Kidnapping. I laughed. Karen, you boarded my boat without permission. You refused to leave when asked. You helped yourself to my property and announced you weren't going anywhere until you were ready. If anyone's been kidnapped here, it's me. The rain was coming down harder now, and the boat was rocking more significantly in the building seas. Karen's friends were discovering that being drunk on a moving boat in rough weather was significantly less fun than being drunk at a static bar. Polo shirt guy, who'd been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly lurched toward the side of the boat and began feeding the fish his earlier champagne consumption. The sound of his retching seemed to underscore the rapidly deteriorating party atmosphere. Oh God, the brunette moaned. I think I'm going to be sick too. That's seasickness, I explained helpfully. It happens when your inner ear can't adjust to the boat's movement. Alcohol makes it worse. Much worse. Karen was still trying to maintain her authority, but she was fighting a losing battle against physics, weather, and the consequences of her own actions. We need to go back right now, she demanded. Do we? I asked. Because an hour ago, you were insisting that you weren't going anywhere until you were ready. Have you changed your mind about that? That was different. How so? Karen struggled for an answer that would make her earlier behavior seem reasonable while her current demands seemed urgent. She was discovering that logic doesn't work the same way when you're 12 miles from shore in building seas. We didn't know we'd be coming out this far, she finally said. You didn't ask how far we'd be going, I pointed out. You just assumed you'd be in control of the situation. The quiet redhead, who seemed to be the only one in Karen's group with any survival instincts, spoke up again. Look, we're sorry about earlier. We shouldn't have gotten on your boat without permission. Can we please just go back now? Finally, someone with manners. Apology accepted, I said. But I'm afraid it's not that simple. Why not? I gestured toward the darkening sky and the increasingly rough water. Weather's getting worse. Visibility is dropping. And honestly, after watching your friends help themselves to my beer and spill champagne on my upholstery, I'm not entirely sure I trust you folks to behave appropriately on the trip back. Karen's face was cycling through several shades of panic and indignation. You can't keep us out here against our will. Karen, I said patiently, you came on my boat against my will. You stayed on my boat against my will. You helped yourself to my property against my will. And now you want me to prioritize your will over mine? That's not really how this works. The brunette chose that moment to join polo shirt guy in the maritime tradition of chumming the water. The sound of two people being violently seasick seemed to drive home the reality of their situation more effectively than any argument I could have made. How long are you planning to keep us out here? The redhead asked, her voice tight, with barely controlled fear. I checked my watch with theatrical precision. Well, let's see. You said you wanted to party for a few hours. It's been about an hour and a half. So I'd say we have at least another hour or two to go. In this weather? Karen looked around at the rain and choppy seas with growing alarm. Oh, this isn't bad weather, I replied. This is just a little chop. Real bad weather would be much worse than this. That's when the first flash of lightning lit up the horizon. The lightning changed everything. What had been an uncomfortable but manageable situation for Karen's crew suddenly became genuinely frightening. There's something about being on the open ocean during a thunderstorm that strips away all pretense and reduces people to their most basic survival instincts. We need to get out of here, Karen shouted over the increasing wind, all traces of her earlier entitlement replaced by raw panic. Right now, I took my time checking the radar and weather instruments, mostly for dramatic effect. The storm was moving through faster than predicted, but it wasn't actually dangerous, just uncomfortable enough to provide the perfect educational experience for my uninvited guests. You're right, I said finally. We should head back. The relief on their faces was almost comical, but it was short-lived. There's just one small problem, I continued, pausing to let another flash of lightning punctuate my words. I need to know that everyone on board is going to follow safety protocols during the trip back. What kind of protocols? The redhead asked, though I could tell she was willing to agree to just about anything at that point. Well, for starters, no more drinking. Everyone needs to be sober enough to follow emergency procedures if necessary. I reached over and began collecting the remaining champagne bottles and beer cans, including the ones Karen's friends hadn't finished. They watched me dump their alcohol over the side without a single protest. Second, everyone stays seated and buckled in during the trip back. No wandering around the deck, no taking selfies, no live streaming the experience. The brunette, who was still looking green around the gills, nodded eagerly. Whatever you say, just please get us back to shore. And third, I continued, there's going to be a small administrative fee for this evening's charter service. Karen's head snapped up. What? Well, you did insist on using my boat for your party. Fuel costs, wear and tear, cleaning fees for the champagne you spilled, replacement costs for the beer you drank without permission. I made a show of calculating in my head. I'd say $5,000 should cover it. $5,000? Karen's voice cracked like a teenager asking for the car keys. That's outrageous. Is it? I asked. What do you think a night charter on a 42-foot cabin cruiser typically costs? What do you think the fine is for boarding someone's vessel without permission? What do you think it costs to clean champagne out of marine upholstery? Another flash of lightning, closer this time, followed by thunder that made everyone jump. We don't have that kind of money with us, Polo Shirt Guy said weakly, though he looked like he'd be willing to write a check for $10,000 if it would get him back to dry land. That's fine, I replied. Venmo, PayPal, Zelle, I accept all forms of digital payment. Assuming we can get enough cell signal out here. I pulled out my phone and made a show of checking for service. Still pretty spotty. Guess we'll have to wait until we get closer to shore. The implication was clear. No payment, no trip back. Karen was practically vibrating with frustration. This is extortion. No. Karen, this is consequences. Extortion would be if I threatened to harm you unless you paid. I'm simply offering you a service, transportation back to shore, in exchange for fair compensation for the damages you've caused and the services you've received. The storm was getting closer, and the boat's movement was becoming more pronounced. Even I was ready to head back at this point, but I wanted to make sure the lesson stuck. Fine, Karen shouted. Fine. We'll pay your ridiculous fee. Just please get us out of here. I smiled and fired up the engines. Now that's the kind of reasonable attitude I was hoping for. The trip back was significantly less comfortable than the trip out. The building seas made sweet revenge pitch and roll in ways that turned Karen's friends various shades of green and gray. The rain had picked up enough that everyone was soaked within minutes. And the combination of fear, seasickness, and stone-cold sobriety had turned their festive party mood into something resembling a funeral procession. Karen spent most of the trip back huddled in the cabin, occasionally emerging to check how much farther we had to go. Her friends had given up all pretense of enjoying themselves and were focused entirely on surviving the experience. By the time we made it back to the marina, the storm had mostly passed, but Karen's group looked like they'd been through a maritime disaster. Their designer clothes were soaked, their makeup was running, and their party-ready attitudes had been completely washed away by reality. As I tied up the boat, Karen's friends practically leaped onto the dock like they were escaping from a sinking ship. The quiet redhead actually kissed the dock planks, which I thought was a nice touch. "Payment," I said simply, holding out my phone. Karen, looking like a drowned rat in designer clothing, fumbled with her phone and transferred the money without another word of protest. $5,000, exactly as quoted. "Pleasure doing business with you," I said cheerfully. "Hope you enjoyed your private yacht charter experience." As they gathered their soggy belongings and prepared to leave, Polo Shirt Guy turned back to me. "You know, this was really messed up, what you did to us." I considered this for a moment. You know what's really messed up? Boarding someone's boat without permission, refusing to leave when asked, helping yourself to their property, and then acting like you're the victim when there are consequences for your actions. Karen's group trudged away toward the parking lot, looking like the aftermath of a very expensive life lesson. I watched them go, then turned my attention back to Sweet Revenge, checking for any damage they might have caused during their brief but educational cruise. The next morning, I found a 1-star review on the marina's Google page. "Worst boat rental experience ever. Owner is crazy and took us out in dangerous weather. Would not recommend." I replied, "Sweet Revenge is a private vessel, not available for charter. Passengers who board without permission sail at their own risk. Weather conditions were within safe parameters for experienced mariners. 5-star experience for teaching maritime law and personal responsibility." The review was removed 2 days later. Karen never came back to the marina, but I heard through the boat owner's grapevine that she'd been telling people about her traumatic kidnapping experience at yacht club events around town. Apparently, the story grew more dramatic with each telling. 6 months later, I was having a drink at the marina bar when Pete, who owned the slip next to mine, brought up the incident. "Whatever happened to that crazy woman who tried to steal your boat?" he asked. "Oh, she learned an important lesson about maritime law," I replied. "And I learned that my boat's name was more prophetic than I realized. Sweet Revenge. Sweet Revenge." Pete raised his glass. "Here's to boats with appropriate names and idiots who provide their own consequences." I clinked glasses with him, looking out at Sweet Revenge bobbing peacefully in her slip. Sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing, and sometimes entitled people provide their own comeuppance. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to be there with a front row seat when it happens. Drop a comment if you've ever had someone treat your property like their personal playground, and hit like if you think some people need to learn about consequences the hard way. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.